We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. I'm Eric Senich. Make sure you subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website bookedonrock.com. Jim Berkenstadt is back on the show to talk about his fascinating book, The Beatle Who Vanished. How could drummer Jimmie Nicol simply vanish after playing with the Beatles in 1964? The Beatle Who Vanished is the first historical account of Jimmie Nicol, an unknown drummer whose journey from humble beginnings to saving the Beatles' first world tour was only one part of his legend. Though his 13 Days of Fame made headlines, the true mystery of Nicol's story is riddled with blacklisting, betrayal, drugs, divorce, bankruptcy, and an eventual disappearance that led many to question whether he's dead or alive. Berkenstadt draws on new documentary evidence, interviews with the Beatles, Nicol, and eyewitnesses, inner circle tour accounts of Nicol and the Beatles. He uncovers the secrets behind Nicol's post-Beatles career and disappearance. Over 100 rare archival photographs and memorabilia illustrations. And it features a foreword by former Beatles bass player Chaz Newby. The Beatle Who Vanished is an Amazon bestseller, and it's being made into a major motion picture. We'll find out from Jim the latest on the motion picture, plus he shares a story of a recent encounter with Jimmie Nicol that you won't find in the book. You'll want to hear this one. Now on to our discussion with Jim Berkenstadt. Jim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be on your show again.
Well, you know, last time I said I got to have you back for this book. So this is a book that's been out a few years. Boy, it's gotten a lot of interest. And I do want to ask you as we get towards the end of this, what is the latest on this book becoming a film? This is all about Jimmie Nicol. What a story. Before we get to his stint with the Beatles, who is Jimmie Nicol? Where is he from? When is he born? Actually, his birthday is coming up, isn't it?
August 3rd or something like that. Yeah.
Yep.
So Jimmie Nicol was this young up-and-coming drummer, and he started playing in the coffee clubs in London as a young man, and also working as a drum repairer, or probably also, just doing tunings and things like that for drums at Boozy and Hawk's music store in London. And I really think that a lot of the early gigs or opportunities he got to, say, sit in when someone else needed to take a break came from the community of musicians that would come in and out of Boozy and Hawk's, and he would hear things and hear opportunities, and then he would go to these various coffee clubs and wait for his opportunity to break in.
And by the way, it's August 3rd. I just did a quick check here. August 3rd, he was born 1939. So Jimmie, he got married at 18. He was in a band who had a real shot at stardom. Things were falling into place for him. Can you talk about Colin Hicks and his Cabin Boys and what became of that band?
Tommy Steele's younger brother was Colin Hicks, and they had both been on these cruise ships where you work the job of, serving the people on the cruises and things like that. Or that's where I think the term Cabin Boys came from with Colin. And his older brother, had gotten famous earlier, and I think he wanted to just pursue the same thing, so he became a singer as well. And Jimmie Nicol joined that band as their drummer, and they had a big opportunity because this guy was making a sort of a European film that was like kind of a party film, where he was showing all these late night fun events going on throughout different countries in Europe. And so when they showed London, Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys played a live performance in front of an audience, and Jimmie gets a big drum solo in there and gets to show off his chops. Colin Hicks is jumping around, and he's certainly, he looked to be influenced to me by Elvis Presley at that time. This was like very late 1950s, maybe 1960 even. As a result, for some reason, people in Italy heard about this movie or saw this movie And the promoters decided it would be a great idea to bring this band over to Italy and have them tour. And so that was really his first big opportunity when he got to play in that band, and they got to go on a tour. And then while they were in Italy too, they got to record several tunes, singles and things over there. And so that was a good experience for Jimmie also to find his way into the studio, because as many musicians will tell you, studio drumming or studio playing is a completely different animal than the more loose, rock and roll that you can play on stage, where people don't really notice mistakes here and there.
He was a legitimate drummer too. Based on what I read in your book, he was a much sought after talent. He definitely could get work. That wasn't the problem.
Right. He definitely was an excellent drummer, and fairly early on, he started to learn how to read music as well, and that helped out when he moved into doing some work with big bands. Big bands, you have to read the music, you have to sight read, like the orchestra leader will just put a bunch of sheet music down for everyone and say, all right, let's try this out, and you have to be able to sight read and do it very close to perfect the first time, or you're not good enough to be in that sort of a band. Same thing is true even nowadays when orchestras play music for television. I've been at some sessions in LA for The Simpsons. They don't do this anymore, but for about 25 years, they used to have a live orchestra, and I'd watch, his name was Alf something, but he put all the sheet music out there for these artists, and they played all these different instruments in the orchestra, and boom, he'd say, all right, let's go. And they would play this song first time they've ever seen it, and you'd go, wow, that's perfect. But then he'd say, oh, the third trumpet, you played a D sharp there in that one spot, we got to change that. So Jimmie got really good at that sort of thing, and I think that really helped him, especially when he moved further in his career, again, pre-Beatles, but moved into the world of doing session music at Pi Records, 63, 64.
So soon after Jimmie gets married and he and his wife have a son, so now financial stability is on his mind more than ever. And he lands another gig, Vince Eager and the Quiet Three. That didn't last, but Jimmie, yet again, he bounces back. He had the talent, he had the work ethic that made him a perfect band member. It's 1960, and Jimmie enters the offices of a man by the name of Larry Parnes. Can you talk about the Rockin' Trad Spectacular? That's the name of it, the New Noise, right? The New Noise of 1960.
Right. So actually, Larry Parnes had also been the manager for Vince Eager, and they got into an argument, and Vince Eager said, I'm just not going to work with you anymore. And Larry Parnes blacklisted him, which kind of comes into play later on in this story of Jimmie Nicol and the Beatles. Larry still, though, saw that Jimmie Nicol was a big talent, so he decided to try to form a kind of something halfway in between rock and roll and a big band. This was at a time when there was, at least in England, there was a transition to get to fewer people in a band. Also, because of the rock and roll that came out of the United States in the 50s, that was becoming quite popular. So this was actually these small, maybe 12 people instead of, say, a big band of 30, but maybe 12 to 15 people. And these sort of almost big band combos were starting to play more rocked up music. And Jimmie, I think, was the perfect guy to, for Larry Parnes to choose. So he kind of got this early chance to be kind of a band leader, even though as band leader, he's stuffed way in the back, on the drums.
There was some significance to that name, the Rockin' Trad Spectacular. Was it as in traditional, or it was some connection there, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, rock, we all know what rock is, or rock and roll, but the trad was a term that the people in England had pulled from New Orleans and wanted to mix rock and roll with traditional jazz. And to them, traditional jazz was a New Orleans style of jazz that they were playing and still play today. And that was just the label they gave it. I don't think they mixed the rock and the trad together. I think it was, you knew you were going to a concert and the band was going to be playing both rock songs and trad songs.
And unfortunately, no audio exists of those shows, but we do have audio of Jimmie's next gig. Jimmie goes on to join the Oscar Rabin Band. They play on a BBC program called Go Man Go. That's so 60s, too.
Yeah.
I love that early 60s.
I know.
Go Man Go. And you say one recording of the show has survived intact. Where can we hear this audio?
Yeah.
Is it on YouTube?
I'm trying to think. I believe that what happened was someone in the Oscar Rabin Band sent me an audio file. It's not anything that I posted or put up online. Because again, I don't know. I don't have the rights to that. I don't have.
I was going to say legal
recording
issues,
rights or the publishing. Yeah, so I didn't want to do anything that would upset anyone. But it was. You could tell it was this BBC show because you hear the announcers and all of that, and then the music. So I think it was just a private recording that someone had probably taped off the radio way back when, and one of those band members kindly shared it with me so that I would be able to describe it in the book.
Well, we know Jimmie, he could get gigs. He gets another one. This time he's a member of the Cyril Stapleton Big Band, and now we're getting closer to that moment that Jimmie gets the call from the Beatles. He's working for the Top 6 record label. And this turns out to be a pivotal moment for Jimmie in terms of getting that Beatles gig.
Right, and not only was it something that helped Jimmie get the Beatles gig, but it helped the Beatles because, as we will discuss, the Beatles didn't have a lot of time and needed someone right away. And how fortunate it is that the stars aligned that they found Jimmie Nicol, because the Top 6 record label was really just a cover band type of label. So the concept of Top 6 was, let's try to predict what the top 6 songs will be in the hit parade list on the radio next week. And let's record those 6 now. And then let's put them in the record stores. And we're basically, not we, but the company is basically fooling the fans into thinking that these EPs they were buying, which had 3 songs on each side, and they were the top 6 songs of the day, they were fooling the fans into thinking that they were the recordings by the original artists, such as Beatles, Rolling Stones, Kinks, whoever was top of the hit parade back then. But in fact, it was Jimmie Nicol and other people in the studio who were very good at learning those songs and then recording them. And sorry fans, but you were fooled. We had that here in the States too when I was growing up in the 60s. There were some of these albums or 45s that would fool us into to buy them, and we thought we were getting a hit collection of a lot of different artists, and it was all cover bands. But what's interesting is, at that time in early 64, when Jimmie started working at Pi as a session drummer and doing the Top 6, significantly, the songs that were most of the hits were by the Beatles. So he was basically learning Ringo Starr's drum parts early on so that he could play them on the Top 6 records. And that's what really helped him when it came time for the Beatles to come calling and asking if he might come down to Abbey Road and play a set with the Beatles before they went on tour.
Somehow that gets to, not George Martin, but it gets to the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, right?
Yes. Brian Epstein had a number of people in his group that he managed. The Beatles were not the only band. There was Jerry and the Pacemakers and others. And I can't remember the name right now because it's been so long, but there was a solo artist, Tommy Quickly, that's his name, Tommy Quickly, who went into the studio at Decca, and I somehow discovered or found out that Jimmie Nicol played drums on that. And so then I contacted the BBC, and they actually had video footage of the day Tommy Quickly went into the studio. Brian Epstein's in this footage, and Jimmie Nicol's in the footage. And you can see Epstein at one point looking through the glass and seeing Jimmie Nicol playing the drums on this Tommy Quickly song. So many people seem to think that George Martin had something to do with discovering Jimmie Nicol. But when I interviewed George Martin while he was still alive, he said, I had never met Jimmie Nicol. I had just vaguely heard of Jimmie Nicol. He didn't play at EMI or what we call Abbey Road Studios now. He had not played here. He wasn't contractually involved with our record labels at all. He did work for Pi. And so he said, back then there wasn't a lot of intermingling of people because the lawyers hadn't figured out how people could leave their label and go work on someone else's record label and their record. So it was interesting that because for some reason for years people have said, yeah, George Martin found Jimmie Nicol just in time for the Beatles, but it really was Brian Epstein who knew them. And also Paul McCartney had seen Jimmie Nicol play live with Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames in like May of 64.
And then comes that fateful date, June 3rd, 1964. Can you take us back to that day as the Beatles are on the eve of their first world tour? What happens?
Well, so imagine how excited they must have been. But of course, with the Beatles, every day was full. It's always a 10-hour day, 12-hour day. So they did have an appointment to do some work at Abbey Road. But before that happened at noon or 11-ish, they were supposed to go to this one location and do a photo shoot. So while they were doing the photo shoot, Neil Aspinall, their trusted road manager at the time, who I also interviewed, he told me that Ringo just completely collapsed, like fainted or passed out or something. And he said, I remember I had to carry him to the car and then we took him to the hospital. So imagine Ringo goes to the hospital less than 24 hours before the start of the first ever world tour. Now, in today's world, we hear all the time about people like just last week, Santana had to cancel 6 shows for exhaustion, and Tommy Lee came back with Motley Crue, but he had 6 broken ribs and he can't quite play, so they have to get another drummer in. And so nowadays, though, there is insurance for tours that can reimburse promoters when a show doesn't happen or they reschedule it or something. But back in those days, the term "the show must go on" truly was the law of the land. There was no way to back out of things just because you had a sick member of your band. You had to get there and do it. And the other thing that's different now is different then from now is back then it took close to a year in actual snail mails going back and forth to all these different countries for Brian Epstein to set up the tour, to set up the transportation, the hotels, the deals for the Beatles to play in all these venues, ticket sales, questions of, what are we going to have in the stores? Are we going to have Beatle wigs or, Beatle pencil boxes or lunch boxes? All these things took forever because we didn't have the internet. We didn't have email. We didn't have inexpensive worldwide calling. A long distance call from England to Australia, for 10 minutes would have probably cost $300 back then. It just wasn't feasible. So that's why everything was done via letters. And I discovered the promoter in Australia. I was able to look through all of his correspondence to Brian Epstein when I got down to Australia researching for the book. And literally it was like 5 boxes of letters. And that was accumulated over a year. And, you put a lot of letters into shoeboxes.
Wow. So it's panic time then.
It was a lot of work.
Yeah.
So Ringo falling down was a big problem, going into the hospital. He had tonsillitis. And so Epstein and Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, they all had to scamper and figure out who we going to find here. So.
And these guys, by the way, those two, for those who may not know, those are their touring managers, right? Those two, Mal Evans.
And yeah. Mal Evans was the roadie, and Neil Aspinall had the title of tour manager at the time, or road manager.
Right.
So the two of them ran out there into London and started trying to contact different drummers and things. It's been so long, I don't remember these other two gentlemen's names, but two other drummers were contacted, and both turned down Brian Epstein when he called them for different reasons.
Ray Duvall, was that one of them?
Yeah, Ray Duvall, and he had his own club at the time, and he thought, well, these Beatles aren't going to. He told me these Beatles aren't going to amount to anything. So, and I don't want to lose. I don't want to have to close my club down and my band and everything while I go off with the Beatles. Then Bobby Graham was a very famous London studio session man in the 60s. And Bobby Graham knew that if you leave the ranks of the studio for any amount of time, the gentleman who's in charge of setting you up with these various gigs and recording sessions will put you way at the back of the line. He'll punish you because you're not around. And Bobby Graham was like probably the number one go-to rock drummer at that time, and he didn't want to be put down in the bottom and have to wait a month or two to start earning a living again. Session players made double the money that the average British, factory worker made at that time, and they worked fewer hours, and it was a great gig. So he turned it down. And then they came up with, well, let's try Jimmie Nicol. Probably, I think that was through Brian Epstein. And Paul called Georgie Fame and said, can we borrow your drummer? Georgie said, sure, for a couple of weeks. And then they asked George Martin to call Jimmy at home because he had played till about 5 a.m. with Georgie Fame. And he was home relaxing. George Martin called him and invited him to come down to Abbey Road to try out with the Beatles.
Suddenly he's caught up in the whirlwind. A wardrobe lady comes to his flat to give him that classic Beatles mop top cut. He's given Ringo his stage outfits. Bit of a challenge. You're right. He's a little more muscular in build than Ringo. It's a tight fit, but
big muscular guy. Yeah. So it was a little bit of a. They had to let out some of the material so he could fit into the jacket.
The next day, he steps out of his Barnes flat on a cool gray morning into a new world. He's picked up by the Beatles chauffeur, and there's John, Paul, and George, along with the PR man Derek Taylor, and they're headed for the airport in a limo. The fans, for the most part, didn't even realize that Jimmy replaced Ringo. You write about people asking the band for autographs, and there's Jimmy signing away.
Nobody even noticed. I talked to one woman in Australia who said that she saw the Beatles when they came out on the whole city, like, was surrounded this building in the hotel where the Beatles were at. And she was down in that crowd and they came out, and I said, did you notice that it wasn't Ringo, that it was Jimmie Nicol or another person? And she goes, no, we had no idea, just it's far away and you see the 4 mop tops. And she said, when we went to the concerts, we didn't know that wasn't Ringo. And that was really part of Epstein's plan was, if we can make him look somewhat like Ringo with the haircut and he's wearing the same suit, it won't be such a big deal. No one will want to cancel their tickets or ask for their money back. But what's nice is that Paul made a point at some of the shows on the tour with Jimmy to actually introduce him to the crowd, which I thought was very nice. He'd say, oh, we're sorry, Ringo's sick, but tonight we have Jimmie Nicol.
And that wasn't a problem with Epstein at all that Paul said?
No, because Epstein wasn't there to say, don't do that.
Okay.
He was back in England because he was waiting for Ringo to get better, and then he was going to fly Ringo to wherever the Beatles were on their world tour once he got better. But I don't think Epstein would have approved of that had he been on the tour.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast @gmail.com. You have a photo from your own collection of one of Jimmie's first Beatles autographs, which you include in the book.
Yeah.
Those autographs are a collector's item these days. How much would one of those go for?
So a set with John, Paul, George, and Jimmie Nicol, which would have only been done during that 2-week time in '64. I'm just going to take a guess at it. From what I've seen at auctions, that could go for between $8,000 and $10,000.
I would imagine, yeah. I'm not surprised to hear that number. Where and when was Jimmie's...
Well, also, George Harrison has passed away. John Lennon's passed away. We can't find Jimmie Nicol anywhere. So it was just a 2-week period that he was part of the group. And so it's a pretty rare find.
Sure. Where and when was Jimmie's first gig with the Beatles, and how did that go down in terms of Jimmie's performance?
I think the first thing he did was perhaps on the 4th or the 5th, but it was, 1 or 2 days after they left England, and it was a TV show, and it started with a little interview between the fans and this one person who had the microphone and the Beatles. And so Jimmie got involved in that, and I think he enjoyed it. The Beatles seemed to make him laugh as much as the audience with their jokes. And then they walked into another room, which was a studio. And it's interesting because they sang live, but the backing recording was actually the records. So they played about 4 or 5 songs for this audience, and they were playing along with the records. And Jimmie was almost just sort of doing this pantomime drum, because I think if he had played something differently on a live mic'd drum from what Ringo was doing, it might have sounded funny to the audience. But these guys, John, Paul, and George were playing their guitars and such, but it was a weird mixture of sound. But then the audience got so carried away that they kind of smothered the Beatles. And so then Neil Aspinall came in and took them away. And you still hear the song going, and Jimmie's still up on the thing, and then it ends. And then he kind of bows and goes, well, I guess I better leave. And no one's trying to, surround him at that point. But I think then that next night they had their first show somewhere in the Amsterdam area, and there is one clip of it on YouTube, and it's the Beatles doing "I Saw Her Standing There" with Jimmie on drums, and it looks like a pro shot type of thing, multi-angle, multi-cameras, etc. And it's really pretty cool. There's kids hanging from the rafters of this building, as well as packing in down below. And at one point, I think John turns around, because it's so noisy. It's hard for the drummer to stay on beat with the Beatles, and that's something Ringo had trouble with as well because of the noise. So John turns around and plays rhythm guitar for him, so he can see where the 2 and the 4 is, so that he can get back in sync with the Beatles on the rhythm part.
And then they removed a couple songs that were Ringo songs.
Yeah. Because obviously, if Ringo was used to singing them, you can't suddenly have the drummer that no one's heard of start singing Ringo's songs. So yeah, they just deleted his. I think he only had one song in the set list.
Was it "I Want to Be Your Man"?
But they had to delete it. Yeah, I think so. And then there was another song where the warm-up band from the Netherlands had played one of the Beatles songs. And that made McCartney really upset, because he wanted to sing it, and then they didn't want to come out and look like the Beatles were copying the warm-up band. I think it was "Long Tall Sally," and it also had been released as a single in the Netherlands. So he had really wanted to sing it, and it would help sales and all, but it was just I think it was just a innocent mistake. The warm-up band liked the Beatles, and just as a tribute wanted to play one of their songs.
There's a great story you tell of Jimmie after that first show. He's in street clothes standing with all of the crazed fans, and none of them noticed who he is. And that's when he realized just how insane it is to be a Beatle.
It's amazing. I mean, he just walked out of the hotel, and and they're all cordoned off, and they're all screaming up at whatever windows the Beatles are in. And he just goes right in amongst all these screaming girls and just kind of looks around like, wow, I'm on the inside, but I'm also able to come out here. No one knows me, and I can observe what's going on firsthand. He's a very interesting guy, very curious, always wanted to know what was going on. He made there were a lot of times where he left the hotel and the security, again, before Brian Epstein showed up, because Epstein would not have allowed that. He was very strict and controlling when they were on tour. But it was interesting because, Jimmy just he's like, I'm traveling the world. I want to see the city we're in. I want to look around Hong Kong.
Carpe diem, seize the moment.
Yeah.
He also took part in press conferences and TV appearances, which it's a lot to put on the guy, but he seemed to roll with it pretty good, right? How did those go?
Well, and again, those are a lot of press conferences with Jimmy are online or they're available on CDs and things. I thought he did really well. He was a couple of years older than the Beatles, and he had fronted his own band, been in other popular bands. He had traveled to Italy with Colin Hicks, so he had some experience that I think served him well. And even though he was kind of blown away by the magnitude of the Beatles' success with their fans, when it came to just a regular press conference, I think he was fine with it. Most of the questions were, what's it like replacing Ringo? That was a pretty regular one. And what are you going to do when you get back home to London when this is all over?
There's a wild night in Amsterdam. I love this one, too. He had a great quote about trying to keep up with John, Paul, and George with the alcohol and girls.
Jimmy was impressed with especially with John and his ability to party and stay up all night and, hang out with all these women. They went into the red light district and such. In fact, I think the police gave him a special escort into that area. He was a married guy, so I don't know. There's sort of allusions to what happens on these tours or what did happen on these tours. I did get some more firsthand information about what the Beatles did in Australia, and they had a good time. There could be a lot of Beatle babies on the continent of Australia who are now
exactly. How
I don't know,
old?
maybe they're
In their 60s.
They're like 50, 60 years old now or something.
I love his quote.
But I would not be surprised.
He says, I was not even close to them when it came to mischief and carrying on. I thought I could drink and lay women with the best of them until I met up with these guys.
That's quite the quote.
Oh,
yeah.
That's so
That's
cool.
what he said.
Talking with Jim Berkenstadt, author of The Beatle Who Vanished. There's an interesting comment from Jimmy during a press conference. He's asked and you mentioned this, he's asked what he's going to do when Ringo comes back. He said he would head back to London, had a couple of TV shows and a band being formed. And then he finishes with, quote, so it looks as though things might happen for me, That's his quote. Before we get to whether that prediction comes to fruition, when does Jimmy's run with the Beatles end? How did the band and Epstein handle that? And how does Jimmy take that? Because there's a moment you write about where he feels the cold shoulder from the fans and the media when Ringo is back.
Well, first of all, when Ringo returns, they go on the rooftop of this hotel, and there's actually 5 Beatles. And you can find photos and video of that online. And so you actually have Ringo and Jimmy. And it's really funny because when Ringo and Jimmy meet up, they immediately start joking around and strangling each other. And, that's kind of a cute thing. And, I think that it's all pretty good natured at that point. And, they all wave to the fans and say a couple things into the microphone. But then they go in for the press conference, and that's where a little bit of friction started to happen between Jimmy and Brian Epstein. So there's 5 Beatles at the table for the press conference, and you can see that the Beatles have kind of regrouped with Ringo. They're very excited to have him back. They're giving him a lot of attention, and Jimmie Nicol's kind of off to the side at this table of 5. And all the questions are, how do you feel now, Ringo? Are you going to sing a song now? And John and Paul are joking with them. And Jimmie, starts to feel like, hey, I'm still here. You can ask me a question. So finally, someone off to the side asks him like a side question, but his microphone is live. So he starts talking, and what's happening is he's talking over the other Beatles who are talking to the main group, one at a time in an orderly fashion. And this upset, I think you can actually see Derek Taylor gets very upset by this behavior. And Brian Epstein is sort of out of the picture, but he's in the room, and he's not happy either. And Jimmie's carrying on a whole side conversation while this press conference is going on, and he's at the same table, and he's talking, and he's picked up on the mic. So it's really kind of making it hard to hear the other Beatles talk. So when that was over, I had interviewed the drummer for Sounds Incorporated, and he said to me that he was right there when Epstein came up and just read Jimmie the Riot Act.
Really?
He said, that was really rude and inappropriate. And then he said, well, we're all done here, so, go up to your room and pack your suitcase. It's basically, you're done, thank you. And Jimmie didn't like that after really keeping the Beatles tour alive, keeping them from being sued by promoters for millions of dollars and things. And the fact that he had, gotten to be friendly with the Beatles along the way. He just felt like this was sort of a rude ending. He didn't realize, I don't think, that he had really disrupted the press conference. Maybe he just didn't know that his voice was carrying out there and was interrupting the other Beatles. But he wasn't happy, so he didn't go pack. He waited till the Beatles were up in their rooms and with their minders and everything, and they were partying. And he snuck out of the hotel to go have a drink at the pub. And when Epstein found out, Epstein blew up again, and he sent Neil and Mal to retrieve Jimmie. And they came in, with the bum's rush, like, what are you doing here? And he's like, well, I'm not a Beatle anymore. And they said, well, they quoted Epstein as saying, you are a Beatle until we put you on that airplane. So again, that was another friction type thing that bothered Jimmie, I'm sure, for longer than just a day. I think it's one of those things that stayed with him for a while. The resentment that he has more and more of, I think, may have become more of a mental health issue than anything else. But certainly at that time, he wasn't too happy. So they took him back to the hotel, and the next morning he didn't have a chance to say goodbye to the Beatles because they were all sleeping, because they'd been up till 6 a.m, laying with the best of them.
Yeah.
So anyway, he left, and there's some footage of him with he and Brian Epstein pretend to be friendly, and they're interviewed by a TV reporter. And then I don't think we actually see Brian give him the famous watch, which was a thank you gift from him and the Beatles. But we then see Epstein escort him all the way to the steps of the airplane. Back then, there were no tunnels or whatever. You had to walk out on the tarmac, go up the ladder, up the steps. So he walks him all the way to steps, I think, to make sure he gets on the plane. And, they pretend to be happy with each other there. And Jimmie makes one last wave and then flies back to London. That's another thing was Jimmie wanted to fly to Sydney and connect up with Frances Faye, a singer who he had sat in with when the Beatles were in Sydney with him. Like one night he went out with Mal Evans. Epstein said, nope, you have a one-way ticket to London. We're not sending you to Sydney and then London.
Oof.
So again, that troubled him because Frances Faye had talked to him about, well, why don't you come back here when you're done with the Beatles? And then we'll fly back to the States, and because I'm going to be recording another album with Capitol Records, and you could be my drummer. So he was like excited about that, but it didn't happen, and he was flown back home. But he did have things popping at home because they had formed a band with a lot of the session guys that he had played with before. And they were called Jimmie Nicol and the Shub Dubs, and they had some TV appearances, radio, and started to play some gigs.
They were asked to appear on the same bill as the Beatles, July of '64.
Right. And actually, Brian Epstein set that up. So, for people to think that he wasn't being kind to Jimmie Nicol, that's a very nice offer to be on the same bill with the Beatles with your band that's, hardly anybody knows. So it was a really nice gesture by Epstein to put Jimmie on the bill.
Yeah, that kind of debunks the rumor that Epstein was out to destroy his career.
Blacklist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that when things, whenever you're in the media or something, it doesn't last forever. Even the most horrific events that happen today in America, 2 weeks later, people have collectively forgotten, or the media stops reporting on them. So here's Jimmie, when he came back from England, he's called the fifth Beatle, and everybody is impressed, and he's wearing suits, and he buys a Ferrari or something. And for a while, he's a big story. And while he's a big story, they're able to play big venues, big gigs. But over time, the gigs keep getting smaller and smaller because he's no longer in the news. And the problem with that was that he guaranteed all these session guys a certain amount of money so that they would be making close to what they were making when they were doing sessions, because he was pulling them out of that area. But once the gigs get smaller and smaller, he couldn't afford to pay them, and they had to disband because they didn't have any big gigs and they weren't being paid.
Psychologically, that's interesting. What that does to somebody when they reach that level of fame for such a short period of time for him. But I guess it doesn't matter how long. Once you get a taste of that, what it does to somebody psychologically, you feel bad for him in that sense, because
right. But I think that he felt he could compete against the Beatles. Like, I've been there, I've seen what they do. I can do the same. I can just create the same sort of thing in my band. I don't think it was realistic, especially because how many people who are drummers in a band, way in the back of the band, become a big band? Dave Clark 5 was, of course, an example of a successful band where the main guy was in the back, but that was a rarity.
Yeah.
And if you're not out front, even Dave Grohl, when Nirvana broke up and he formed the Foo Fighters, what did he do? He left the drums to Taylor Hawkins, and he strapped on a guitar and he was out front. If he had stayed behind on the drums and just had a nameless person singing, I don't think the Foo Fighters would be who they are today.
And his wife, Pat, grew tired of it too, right? His marriage ended. Yeah,
so back to Jimmie. Yeah, his marriage became an issue. I don't think she liked all the female fans and all of that. And actually, after the book came out, a woman sent me a really long email and said that she had an affair with him and that may have broken up Jimmie's marriage and all that. I couldn't verify it or get her to go on record, but who knows? But there were a lot of women around who found him suddenly attractive because he had that sort of Beatle halo on him. And, he spent all his money on a car and really nice suits. So he looked good. But in the end, he got a divorce, and then he got another band, the Jimmie Nicol Show or something like that. And that was in the first half of 1965. And again, he overspent with that band, and they didn't gain any traction. Even though they had the Hollies manager, they didn't get any traction. And again, they had a nameless lead vocalist that no one knew. When they sort of crash landed, Jimmie was now divorced and bankrupt, unemployed, and out of work.
Man, he was living at home too. He moved back in with his mom, I think, right?
With yeah.
There was an occasion where George Harrison was at one of his gigs, and he tried to buy him a drink, and Jimmie declined the offer. He was offended by that.
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmie was playing a little club gig with that band, the last band we just discussed, and George just wanted to, again, a nice gesture, again, and, we were friends on the tour, thanking him, all that, and Jimmie just turned it down, rebuffed him. But then there was like a newspaper story, because the newspapers love to do the rise and the fall of people. So they wrote a whole big story about how Jimmy was now bankrupt, divorced, unemployed. And Paul McCartney read that. And so he talked to Peter Asher, who was the brother of the girl that Paul was dating at the time, Jane Asher. And Peter and Gordon, he said, hey, if you could use Jimmie Nicol either in the studio or on tour, maybe you could give him a chance. He's a great drummer, a good guy. So they hired him for a while. And Georgie Fame always felt burned by Jimmie Nicol because he had this great drummer in Jimmy. Jimmy went off for 2 weeks, and then when he came back, he rebuffed Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. So Georgie wasn't happy with him. The studio people weren't going to rehire him because, again, he didn't come back to do studio work after that either. He wanted to make it as a big rock band, and it just never happened for him. So even though Paul McCartney was very helpful to him, eventually that work dried up. In fact, I talked to Peter and Gordon while Gordon was alive as well, and they didn't really have much of a memory of it, just that, yeah, Paul asked us to hire him and help him out, and that he was very talented.
That's what's interesting too, is that he could make money if he wanted to as a session musician, but again, I think that experience with the Beatles affected his ego in a way where I don't need that. I can make it out. I could become a big timer. I don't think he
right. And then when all these things dried up and it didn't work out, he remembered back to the Vince Eager, Larry Parnes incident, where Larry Parnes blacklisted Vince Eager for 2 years in the entertainment world. And so I really think Jimmy felt that somehow Brian Epstein had blacklisted him. And I didn't buy that argument at all. But
well, that's what I was about to say. What would be in it for Brian Epstein to do that? I don't see what his motive would be. Well, how would it benefit him?
Right. When I talked to Tony Bramwell, who was Brian's assistant. He's still alive today. People can find him on Facebook. He said, no, Brian was very happy and pleased with Jimmy's work on that tour. And that's why he gave him a gig on the same bill as the Beatles like a month later. It was a reward, a thank you. And he said, after that, Brian just moved on. He didn't hold any grudges at all.
You know what it is? Jimmy needed somebody to blame.
Right.
And it wasn't even necessarily his fault either. He put his best foot forward. It doesn't happen. That's the entertainment business.
That's right.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The Booked on Rock podcast is online at bookedonrock.com. Find a list of all the major platforms where you can listen and subscribe to the podcast. Link up to our social media sites. Find out the latest Books on Rock releases. Find your nearest bookstore. And if you want to reach out to us, you can contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com. The book is called The Beatle Who Vanished. Author Jim Berkenstadt with us to talk about the book, which originally came out in 2013. There's also a movie in the works. We'll get to that in a bit. I'll ask you about that. But he did continue to work. He had a band, the Spotniks, in the late 60s. He was an A&R guy for RCA. He does settle down in Mexico. He gets remarried. But again, he doesn't get past that resentment for Brian Epstein. His wife, Julia, recalled conversations that she had with him about that in the late 60s.
Well, one of the things she talked about was, when they were married, that he became frustrated with where their career was at in Mexico. And, they had formed a band and they had toured a little bit and done well, but, nothing on the same scale of the Beatles or even the Spotniks. And he was frustrated and he started to blame Epstein and say, he's blacklisting me. Epstein didn't even know he was in Mexico. He didn't know where he was. So he blamed Epstein and he took the famous gold watch that Epstein had engraved and given to him, that was to him from the Beatles and Brian Epstein, and thanking him for his help. And Julia said he just smashed it into a drawer. There was a drawer open and a dresser. And she said everything just kind of exploded, all the pieces of this watch, and said that she tried to put it back together. But I mean, who of us can put an old fashioned watch back together? Little screws and springs, you can't do it. So he threw away the watch, but he kept the back, the engraved part, for several decades.
He destroyed the watch, but he still couldn't destroy that memory. He couldn't get rid of it.
Yeah.
It's like a ghost haunting him.
Because once the book came out, again, that's one of the interesting things, that when you write a book and you put it out to the world, people who you maybe didn't know existed had some interaction with this person. So I got a call from a guy in England who'd been involved in radio and such, and he had been tasked with some sort of BBC interview, like Where Are They Now? And so Jimmie Nicol came up in that group, and he went to Jimmie's apartment. This is not in the book because, again, I didn't hear about it till after the book came out. I went to his apartment looking for him, but this guy went to his apartment, and Jimmie answered the door and said, we want to do this thing like it's been 30 or 40 years since you were with the Beatles, and where are they now? And he said, I really don't want to talk about that. I don't want to, my career is so much more than the Beatles, yada, yada. So he said, just a minute. And he slammed the door on this guy, right? Just slammed it right in his face. And this guy said to me, I don't know. I didn't know whether I should stay or wait or go, or, I didn't know if he was coming back. Well, Jimmie Nicol came back like 10 minutes later, and he had a little brown paper sack, the kind that you'd put a sandwich in and take to work. And he said, here, this is how much I don't want to talk to you about the Beatles. And he gave it to this guy, and he said, don't open this till you get home. So the guy didn't open it till he got home. His wife's like, what happened? He said he didn't want to talk to me, but he gave me this bag. He opened up the bag, and there was the watch back with the Brian Epstein and Beatles inscription on it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This happened around 2005 or something. No, 2004, because that would be an anniversary with 1964. Yeah. So it wasn't in the book because I didn't hear about it till this guy read my book and said, oh, I got a story for you. Yeah. It's an exclusive on your show.
Oh yeah, I'm just sitting here like my eyes are wide open, like what? This isn't in the book. Yeah, and
right.
His career did continue,
Yeah.
but he does get out of music in the 70s. He puts music behind him, gets into construction business. Isn't that what he ended up doing?
Yeah, he moved back to London from Mexico. He got divorced from Julia. In fact, it's funny because Julia's on Facebook and her husband's on Facebook, and so it's really nice to still be in touch with some of these people. So is Vince Eager. So some of the people in the Beatle Who Vanished are just like still doing well and are on Facebook, and people can actually reach out to them. It's kind of interesting. But he goes back to London, and he started like a remodeling business. And I can't remember now which artist, but it was someone who he had played with in London back in the old days, hired him to do some work in their home. And he said, boy, he and his people did a beautiful job of remodeling our house. So he had a very good reputation doing that. And then after that, around 84, he was asked to go to a Beatle convention in Holland. What was really nice was the organizer of that festival, which I think they still do it. He and a couple other people with him had taken Jimmie and Howie into a private conference room at some point during that weekend and recorded a private interview with Jimmie that had never been published or put out anywhere. And he sent me a cassette of that so that I could, talk about it. And so I talk extensively about that in the book as to what Jimmie was saying. He was planning to write a book at that time about his career that included the Beatles, etc. And, there'll be many surprises and all that. And his son had some thoughts on it, and you could sort of see that they were arguing with each other at this meeting. And then I discovered in, I think it was 2011 maybe, that Jimmie and Howie were no longer in communication with each other. And prior to that maybe a couple of years earlier, Jimmie had left England and vanished. Again, this was after the book came out. I was able to meet with Jimmie's cousin in Scotland, in Edinburgh. His name is, I believe, Ronnie Nicol. And they were very close. And I could tell because Ronnie brought along a lot of postcards of Jimmie. And, they had the dates on them. And even though Jimmie would sort of stop communicating with people whenever he would leave something, like when he left Sweden with the Sputniks after spending a couple of years with them, they just never had any contact with him. So that was like his thing. He would get done with something or be upset with something and he would vanish again and no one would know where he went. But he always stayed in contact with his cousin. And then sometime around 2011 or so, Jimmie just took off and no one has seen or heard of him since. I believe he's somewhere in Mexico. That's my guess.
That's what leads to the mystery, though, over the years. When he disappears like that, is he dead?
Yeah.
Is he incognito?
Right. I was able to find him until this last time. I mean, I even hired a guy who was a very well-known internet detective expert guy in technology. And he's written books about how you can even disappear in this day and age of electronics and digital imprints and all that. And I thought, well, if anyone can find him, this guy. And he tried for a good 2 months, looking all through Mexico and even some South American countries like Brazil, because there were rumors about him going to Brazil because he liked that music there. But empty-handed, otherwise I would have, written another chapter 2 or volume 2, Jimmie Nicol found again.
So you got pictures of him here from the 80s, and he has this mop top haircut. I guess maybe he did it just for the fan event. I don't know, but he had a mustache.
I don't think he changed his hair. I think he just kept getting older, but kept the Beatle type hairstyle.
Signing autographs for fans. How was he with the fans when they asked him about the Beatles?
Well, I talked to 2 of those fans who attended that convention in Holland, and they said he was super happy, super nice. He enjoyed being there. One of them was a photographer and said, Jimmie said, hey, can I go back to the hotel room where we were and the canal ride and all that? And this guy went along and took pictures of him. And I think the canal boat people let him steer the boat on the canal and, kind of reliving the whole Beatle experience. But I think he liked, the little burst of fame and people, really happy. I can't tell you how many people in America have said to me, can't you find him? Because we'd love to have him come to our conventions and we'd love to meet him and have him play drums and, talk to the fans. There's a lot of people who, are fascinated by his story and would really like him to, show up. I'd like him to show up on the red carpet of the film that's being made about him.
Oh, wouldn't that be, wow, what a promotional tool that would be. Yeah, that'd be cool. If he was comfortable doing it, of course, I mean, that,
right.
If he's cool with it.
I just don't think he's,
You mentioned his son is Howie. You mentioned that, right? Howie is his son's name. And, he was blessed with 2 gifts then, because the remodeling, somebody said he did a beautiful job. So he's able, he's a musician. He was actually
good at all.
He was a performer too. I forgot to ask about that. In the early days, he would do these, he had these little performances he put on, like, I don't know what you call it, like a stick or whatever you want to call it.
Pantomime or I don't know. But like Vince Eager and Jimmie had something worked out where I can't remember whether it was Jimmie shooting Vince or Vince shooting Jimmie, and then the other guy would fall over dead and the crowd would go, oh no. Yeah, so they had all these silly antics that they would do back then along with the performance of the music.
So here's a question. Do we leave people in mystery? Did you get a chance to interview Jimmie Nicol for the book?
Well, the answer to that is found in the last chapter of the book.
The epilogue?
When I actually go to England, and the first things I do are follow in his footsteps. So I go to the coffee clubs where he started out. I go to the studios where he worked, that sort of thing. And then I ultimately end up, the plan was for Vince Eager and me to go to Jimmie's apartment, and because I thought this might go smoother if one of his old buddies are with me rather than just another journalist, who wants to, or author who wants to meet him and talk to him. But Vince hurt his leg or something right before that. So I did it on my own, and I'll leave it to the readers to discover what I discovered when I knocked on Jimmie Nicol's door.
And the photo, the eerie photo.
Oh, the eerie photo. Yeah. He lived kind of in an apartment in an alleyway. It was very, very secluded in the Camden area of London, which is kind of a cool artsy place. But the shadows that day and the leaves in the trees left a remarkable imprint on the wall right next to his apartment. And I almost didn't notice it because I was thinking about what am I going to say to him, blah, blah, blah. But then after I left the building, I took one last look down the alleyway, and I'm like, oh my God, am I seeing things? So that's a cool picture that people might find of interest in.
I've seen it, folks. I'm looking at it right now. You got to see it. And then you do have the last known photo of Jimmie Nicol in the book.
Right. There was I think around 2004 that might have been. I'm not positive of the date, but it was in the 2000s that he was he had walked to some sort of bank or credit union, and then he went to some lunch place to get a sandwich, and there was some sort of paparazzi guy who was following him around and took his pictures, and I was able to locate him and license some of those photos. So in the very, very last photo, you're right, in the book, he's actually walking away from us, just sort of vanishing into the city, people and crowd and such. So I thought that was an appropriate ending.
I'm surprised that the paparazzi even knew who to look for in terms of what he's going to look like. Because even in this photo, it doesn't look like him. We're looking at him from behind, but his hair's different. He's older. I don't know how you'd even recognize him. So
I think it would
hats
be
off to that
difficult.
guy. However, he was able to track him down.
Well, I think what he told me, he told me how he was able to track him down. So I might as well share that with your listeners.
Okay.
He said that he looked up Jimmie's formal name, which is James George Nicol, I believe. And they have the voting rolls in England, which are public. And so you can look and see who the voters are, and it's all alphabetized. And he found Jimmie Nicol, and then he found the address. And what he did was he kind of waited outside the alley until Jimmie walked out to do his errands and get his lunch. And he's like, this has got to be him.
Wow.
And
it makes me think of Syd Barrett a lot. Syd Barrett does a similar thing in the later years. Of course, Syd had a much bigger role in Pink Floyd than Jimmie did with the Beatles. I get that. But it's just that eeriness of, wow, there he is, It'd be like, there's Syd Barrett taking out his trash, and then you see Syd just looking up like, why are you taking a picture of me? Yeah. Yeah. So,
well, it's interesting. Some famous people just want to not be famous anymore, and sometimes that's very difficult.
I heard it was Syd Barrett's nephew that said that Syd would get the checks in the mail, publishing checks, and he just threw them out. Wanted nothing to do with Pink Floyd. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and we lost Syd Barrett, wasn't 04 or 05, I think.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, I think.
Yep. So let's get to the movie project. When did this all start? Okay. All right, and what's the latest that you can tell on this movie project?
I think I want to say 2017, I got this phone call from some lawyer in LA, and she said, have you optioned the film rights to your Jimmie Nicol book? And I said, no. I said, I've had some inquiries, like Paramount had me out to LA, and I pitched to them, but I think that was a bit earlier. And when I pitched to them, we were still in whatever the last recession was called. I guess we call it the last recession. And so they actually made an offer and wanted to make a movie, but then whoever's the head of the studio started cutting all these budget things. and that included budgets for options. So that went by the wayside. So then I said, no, I haven't sold the option rights to the book. And she said, well, I have, prominent people who are very interested in it. Would you like to sell it to them? I said, well, who are they? And she said, oh, well, I'm not at liberty to give out their names. And I said, well, I'm not going to do a deal with people I don't know. I want to see if we get along, and I want to see if we have similar concepts about how to make this into a cool movie. I said, so why don't you go back to them and tell them I'd like to have a chat with them? Oh, I don't know. They're very famous. Well, anyway, I said, okay, a lot of famous people. I've talked to famous people. Not a big deal. So, and they were like the most down to earth.
And it's
nice
my book.
People.
It's my book, damn it.
Yeah, exactly. You want my book, then I want to meet who's the person that's interested. So turned out that it was Ashley Hamilton, who is an actor and the son of George Hamilton, actor-director.
Wow.
And then also Alex Orbison, who's the youngest son of Roy Orbison. And they're friends, and they're both musicians. And in fact, Alex is a drummer, and so he had seen, someone had mentioned my book on the Roy Orbison Facebook page, which he was monitoring, and he thought, oh, this is interesting. And also, he of course knew that his dad had toured with the Beatles in England in 1963, and he knew that his dad had been a traveling Wilbury with George Harrison. So there's a lot of that swirling around, plus a story about a drummer he'd never heard of who played with the Beatles and then vanished. So he read the book and loved it. Then he told Ashley he read the book, he loved it. So then we got on the phone and we had the best conversation. I felt like we'd been friends, forever. Very nice people, and we're still friends. Then I said, yeah, I'll option the book to you. And then after the option, I got a direct request from a studio in England that wanted to option the book. So I put them in contact with Ashley and Alex, and then all three of us groups made a new deal so that this company in London called ECOS, which has made some really cool films. If you're a Beatle fan, you maybe have heard of a movie called Nowhere Boy, which is a really cool indie film about John Lennon's early life all the way up until the Beatles become very famous.
I do remember hearing about that one. I never saw it, but I do remember hearing about it.
Yeah, it's a good movie. And they've made all their movies have to have some connection to the United Kingdom. And so that's just their mission or their theme. And they did a great one about Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret being very young when World War II ended, and they wanted to leave the castle or whatever and go out and celebrate with the common people. And it's a hilarious movie, and I highly recommend it. I can't think of the name of it, but they've made some really great movies. So we did a deal with them, and the film is currently in development. We did have an initial screenwriter who I worked with for about 6 months, and then I can't remember exactly what happened, but there was some sort of creative disagreement between the producers and the writer. So now I think they have gotten a new screenwriter, and once he comes on, they'll probably put him in touch with me again. Because sometimes they'll say, well, what do you think of if you have to make certain compromises when you turn a book into a film, because books are quite a bit longer in content than a film that's an hour and a half long. So what do you think we cut this out, but then we add in this story that never happened, but because it helps us bridge from A to B or A to C.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting.
With Jaws, I remember they talked about with Jaws, the book Jaws has so much more in it that is not in the film. And
right. Yeah, that's true of a lot of
books
and films. So
do you have to give approval? Do you have to give approval though if they want to do something different?
No, I I think I'm an executive producer, but I'm not an approval or anything like that. I don't have creative control over the film, but also I'm not a filmmaker. So I think that whatever they want to do will be best for telling the story in a film sort of way instead of a book way. And if people are like, well, I didn't learn enough from the film, they can go back and read the book.
So
a lot of people like to read the book right before a film comes out because then they know much more about it. And then they can say, okay, the book's real and this is what really happened. Now here's how the film is different. And they sort of like to compare the two. But yeah, I'm fine with whatever, what they want to do is they want to do a very respectful movie about his career and of course play up. I'm sure they're going to play up the Beatle angle because that'll put more people in the seats. But I think it'll be interesting. And I think they're fascinated by the fact that each segment of his career that he would just sort of go off and vanish and then he'd reappear somewhere else.
So for those of us not in the know with how this works, so then that means then they would have to make the film. They're going to obviously have to get the cast, do all that. And then what do they sell it to a studio to try to get it distributed?
Well, I think they have distribution in terms of theaters, but also I've seen that a lot of their movies also end up on Amazon Prime. I think it all works out.
Timetable here, no idea.
I think things will accelerate once the script is completed and approved. Because then once that happens, they've worked with so many different technicians, from directors to editors to cameramen, etc., because they make movies. The COVID thing just completely shut down that whole studio. They didn't put out a single movie, but they kept moving ours along, which I'm really happy about. So I definitely think the movie will be made. The timetable, like I said, once you have a script, then okay, we need a scene at Abbey Road, or we need a scene here, we need a scene there. And you don't know that till the script. Same with casting. Not every single person I mentioned in the book is going to be in the movie. And so the people that are, they'll start going, okay, here's a picture of what this guy looked like, or they'll ask me, we don't have a picture in the book of this guy. What's he look like? I'll give them a picture. And then they'll try to find some actors. Again, you have Jimmie Nicol in England. He then travels the world with the Beatles. So you have different countries speaking different languages and accents. You have Jimmy going to Sweden with the Sputniks. So you have that. If they, if they choose to have that as part of the film. So you have different locations, which cost different amounts of money. You have different actors, maybe from different countries. Certainly they'll probably do Mexico. So they'll have people with, an accent there. They might decide to film down there, or they might say, oh, we can film it in Spain. It'll be less money. There's all types of options because, movies are make-believe.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is budgeting. And then once that's done and approved, then, they move into production. So I can't really say how long that'll take because I don't know.
Can you imagine how awesome it would be for Mike Myers of Saturday Night Live fame, Mike Myers of Hollywood Mike, playing the older Jimmie Nicol? That would be cool.
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Right? Who would you like to play the young Jimmy and the older Jimmy?
I don't, a lot of people ask me those questions and I'm like, I don't care. I want them to just pick whoever they think is good and let's go. Let's go to the movies.
Yeah.
You know what? I wrote the book. They're making the movie and I'm just there to help them if they have questions. One thing that, one of the things that could come up would be, let's say the Beatles don't want to license an actual Beatle recording. So then you have different options. Number one, the Beatles did perform songs that weren't their own.
Oh, that's
Chuck
right.
Berry's
Yeah, the licensing of all the songs. That's a big thing.
So so they can certainly license some of the songs the Beatles did on that tour that were not written by the Beatles. because, those are a lot easier to license. So
That's-
there's all types of questions. And then, there was a movie called Backbeat. I don't know if you saw that. Yeah, it's
don't
really
think
cool.
I saw it. I know of it. I remember hearing about that one too.
Oh, okay. So that was a book or a movie about the Beatles with Stu Sutcliffe when they were going off to Hamburg and stuff. It's a really cool movie. I highly recommend it. But in that movie, what they chose to do with music was they got together kind of a super group of 90s artists, rock artists, and put them all together. And I know Dave Grohl was a part of that. And put them together, and they were the band that represented the music in the movie. And then the actors who looked like the Beatles would sing and play, but it was this super group doing kind of a different version. So there's so many ways you can do that, or they could find some sort, how many Beatle cover bands are there in the world?
Oh, I know. Good ones too. I saw one here. Saw one here in Connecticut.
That's another one.
I'm trying to remember the name, but they did all of the eras and they did the costumes, the whole thing. There's so many great Beatles tributes out there. Well, I hope. Well, two things. I hope once that movie comes out that I can have you back on here again, because I'm sure you're going to be busy promoting it. But I'd love to have you back on. And two, I want like a Jim Berkenstadt type of like Alfred Hitchcock thing. I want like something where you're just walking off the bus and you say, "Oh, wait a minute, there he is."
It's really, that cracks me up, because of course I want that too. But when I was a kid, my neighbor and we used to make these little Super 8 movies, and we made one, some kind of creepy, scary one that was in black. We purposely made it in black and white. And it was like our version of like a little short Hitchcock mystery film. And it was called Outside Looking In. And there's this one moment where the creepy character looks out the window of his apartment, and I happen to be walking by. I'm in a suit with an umbrella and a little hat. So I did do that. I did do the Hitchcock cameo in my own film, so it would be awesome. I do plan to go out to London and watch some of the production when it happens. So
that would be fun.
I'll remember that, and I'll volunteer.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, where can people can get the book through Amazon, but where can people find you online, social media, right? And are there any projects that you want to promote that you're working on? What's the latest? I had you on for that last book, which was awesome.
Yeah. Mysteries in the Music, Case Closed, which, by the way, just today I got word that I won a gold medal from the Nonfiction Book Association for Best Pop Culture Book of the Year. I'm really
outstanding.
excited.
Yeah. Well deserved, man. That's a great book.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
the
awesome.
Beatle Who Vanished, if they want signed copies, I have a special website. Plus, also that website has video of Jimmie Nicol. There's a video section where people might enjoy seeing him play a drum solo or something. But that one, you go to thebeatlewhovanished.com, and you can find out more about Jimmie Nicol. And if you want a signed copy, there's a way to order it right there through PayPal. Then, of course, Amazon. People can reach me at, I have a Facebook page called Rock and Roll Detective on Facebook. And then I'm on Facebook under Jim Berkenstadt. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I think on Instagram, I'm Rock and Roll Detective, and Twitter, I'm at Rock Detective.
And the website is called, isn't there the website, therockandrolldetective.com or something to that?
.com. Yeah, if you want to know more about what I've done in the past with the Beatles and with other bands, and also some of my own projects, rockandrolldetective.com is a good place to start.
Yeah, all those links will go up.
Also, IMDb. Yeah.
IMDb, yes.
Also, in fact, speaking of IMDb, which is TV and movies and things, I'm doing doing research for a new film that will be about kind of the rise and fall of hard rock or heavy metal music from the late 80s, mid 80s through about 91 when Nirvana came along. It'll be a documentary on Paramount Plus.
Oh, cool. Okay.
And again, I'll put information out once that movie comes out, but it's really interesting because it's really not an era that I had spent much time on as as a younger person because I was starting out as a lawyer and I was getting married and moving and then we had a kid. So I kind of missed that whole period, but I'm getting caught up on Skid Row and
Oh man!
and,
Well, I'll tell you.
Motley Crue.
You know
and all that.
what's crazy is that I did live through that, and what was so wild about that is just as that whole genre was shifting, just as Nirvana's hitting, and Nirvana just takes down all of those bands. I'm in a change of life. I go to college, and it's like this new chapter of my life, and all of a sudden, all of these bands are huge. I just remember that time. You felt the shift. Everything was changing. You'd walk out into the dorm and on the TV was all these. I remember seeing Pearl Jam's a live video on MTV walking through the dorm. And it's like, who the hell is this? And then, the next video would be Poison, Poison and Motley Crue in between those. Yeah. Weird.
And the first time I saw Teen Spirit, with Nirvana on MTV, I was just like, oh my God, this is really interesting. This is like a whole new rock world coming in the 90s here. It was pretty cool. By then things had settled down so I could get back into rock and roll again.
Yeah.
So I was blown away by Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins and all of that.
Jim, this was great. I wanted to have you back on to talk about this book because it's such a fascinating story, and I'm sure you're going to be back on again in the future. You got books, I'm sure, that you plan for years to come. At least I hope. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Me too.
All right, Jim.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
As always, thank you for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.